He thought humiliating her would get a laugh, but he had no idea he was about to lose the room completely. The lecture hall at Westbridge University buzzed with low conversation, the kind that fills space before something important begins. Rows of polished wooden desks stretching back beneath bright overhead lights as students checked their phones and whispered to one another, waiting for Dr. Marcus Hale to arrive, a man whose reputation alone could quiet a room faster than any bell. Known across campus for his brilliance and his intolerance for anything he considered beneath his standards, and today was no different as he stepped in precisely at 9 a.m., his tailored charcoal suit sharp against the whiteboard behind him, his presence instantly pulling every eye forward as conversations died mid-sentence and a hush settled over the room, the kind of silence built on expectation and a little fear, because everyone knew Dr. Hale didn't just teach mathematics. He tested people, exposed them, reduced them if they weren't ready, and he seemed to take a quiet satisfaction in doing so, his gaze sweeping the room like a scanner before pausing briefly at the back where a woman sat alone, her gray cardigan plain, her posture straight but unassuming, her notebook already open as if she had been there longer than anyone else. Clara Bennett, though no one in the room knew her name. Not really. To them she was just someone who didn't belong, someone who had slipped into a place reserved for minds sharper, faster, more qualified. And the faint smirks that passed between a few students said as much without a word, because in a room like this, appearances were everything, and Clara didn't fit the mold, not with her simple clothes, not with the quiet way she kept her eyes on the page instead of the professor, not with the absence of any visible confidence they could recognize. But Dr. Hale noticed her, and more importantly, he judged her within seconds, the way he always did, categorizing, dismissing, deciding, his lips pressing into a thin line before he turned back to the board and began writing, chalk moving quickly as symbols filled the space in a complex sequence that made even the top students sit up straighter, an equation layered and dense, the kind that wasn't meant to be solved easily, the kind that separated those who truly understood from those who only thought they did. And when he stepped aside, he didn't explain it right away. Instead, he turned slowly, letting the silence stretch, letting anticipation build, because he knew exactly what he was about to do. And somewhere in that room, a few students exchanged glances, sensing it too. The setup, the moment before something uncomfortable unfolded. Dr. Hale clasped his hands behind his back and tilted his head slightly, his voice calm, but edged with something sharper as he said, "Let's try something different today," his eyes drifting again to the back row, locking onto Clara with deliberate intent. Perhaps someone who isn't part of this department would like to give it a try. And just like that, the shift began, a ripple of quiet amusement moving through the room, a few suppressed laughs already surfacing as students turned in their seats, curious, expectant, because they thought they knew exactly how this would end. And in that moment, Clara closed her notebook slowly, her expression unreadable, her eyes steady, as if she had already seen what was coming long before anyone else did. And the room, still unaware, leaned in, waiting for the humiliation they believed was inevitable. Clara did not move right away, and that hesitation was all the room needed to confirm their assumptions as a few quiet chuckles slipped into the air, growing just enough to be noticed but not enough to be called out, the kind of laughter that feeds on certainty, because to them this was already decided, a simple woman in a room far beyond her reach, a moment that would end exactly as expected, and Dr. Hale allowed it, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp with quiet anticipation as he gestured toward the front with an open hand. "Come on," he said, his tone light, but edged with something unmistakable. "Do not be shy." And there was a ripple of movement as heads turned, some students leaning back to get a better view, while others exchanged knowing looks, already bracing for the discomfort they believed was inevitable. But Clara finally stood, not rushed, not flustered, just deliberate, her chair sliding back softly against the floor as she gathered her notebook and set it aside, her movements calm in a way that did not match the energy around her. And for a brief moment, something in that composure created a flicker of uncertainty in the room, but it passed quickly, dismissed just as easily as she had been, because confidence without credentials meant nothing here, or at least that is what they believed. And as she began walking down the aisle, the sound of her footsteps seemed louder than it should have been, each step measured, steady, unhurried, while whispers trailed behind her like a current, low and constant. "Is she serious?" Someone murmured. "This is going to be painful," another added. Under their breath, and near the front row, a student shook his head slightly, already smirking as if the outcome had already been written. And through it all, Dr. Hale watched closely, not just observing her, but studying her, waiting for the telltale signs of hesitation, the nervous glance, the uncertain pause, something to confirm his judgment. But Clara gave him none of it, her gaze remaining forward, her expression composed, almost neutral, and when she reached the board, she stopped just short of it, her eyes lifting briefly to take in the equation that stretched across the white surface. And for the first time, the room went quiet enough to notice the silence itself, because now it had begun, now the moment was real, and Dr. Hale stepped slightly to the side, giving her space but not relinquishing control, his voice carrying clearly as he said, "Take your time." Though the faint curve at the corner of his mouth suggested he did not expect her to need much of it, and a few soft laughs followed, quickly stifled but not entirely gone, and Clara reached for the chalk, her fingers closing around it with a steadiness that did not match the narrative forming in everyone else's mind, and she paused, just for a second, not out of confusion but consideration, her eyes scanning the equation with quiet focus. And in that pause, the room leaned in again, waiting, expecting, convinced that what came next would confirm everything they already believed, unaware that the story they were watching had already begun to shift in ways they could not yet see. The chalk hovered just a fraction of an inch from the board, and that single suspended moment stretched longer than anyone expected, long enough for the room to begin filling the silence with quiet assumptions, long enough for a few students to exchange glances that said this was exactly what they thought it would be, hesitation dressed up as effort, uncertainty disguised as focus, and somewhere near the center row, a low whisper slipped out. "She does not even know where to start," followed by a faint snicker that quickly spread in small, contained bursts, the kind of laughter people allow themselves when they believe they are safe from being proven wrong. And Dr. Hale did nothing to stop it, his arms folding loosely across his chest as he leaned back slightly, watching, measuring, waiting, because this was the moment he valued most, the unraveling, the exposure, the confirmation of hierarchy, and he was certain it was coming. But Clara remained still, her eyes moving across the equation not as someone overwhelmed, but as someone tracing something already familiar, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, and then, without announcement, without any visible shift in confidence, she made her first mark, a small one, almost unimpressive, just a single line adjustment at the edge of the equation, and a few students frowned slightly, confused, while others let out another quiet laugh, interpreting the movement as a random attempt rather than intention, and Dr. Hale's expression barely changed, though there was a flicker of curiosity that passed quickly as he dismissed it, because one correct line meant nothing without direction, and Clara paused again, her gaze narrowing slightly as if aligning pieces in her mind, and then she wrote another step, this time slightly larger, connecting terms in a way that did not follow the standard method most of the class had been taught. And that was when the first real shift occurred, subtle but undeniable, a small break in the rhythm of expectation, because a student in the front row leaned forward just a bit, his brow furrowing as he tried to follow the logic, and another stopped smirking entirely, their attention sharpening as the structure began to form into something unfamiliar, something that did not look like a mistake. But still, the room was not convinced, not yet, because belief takes longer to change than doubt. And Dr. Hale stepped closer, just slightly, his eyes scanning her work with more focus now, searching for the flaw he expected to find, the inevitable misstep that would restore the balance he understood, but it did not come, and Clara continued, her movements gaining a quiet rhythm, not rushed, not hesitant, each line placed with precision that did not announce itself but built steadily, like a pattern revealing itself only to those paying close enough attention. And the whispers began to fade, replaced by something else, something quieter, heavier, a tension that filled the room as the laughter died out not all at once, but piece by piece, as realization slowly pressed in around the edges of what they were seeing. And Clara did not look at anyone, did not react to the shift, she simply kept writing, as if the room no longer existed, as if the noise, the judgment, the expectations had all fallen away, and in their place was only the equation, unfolding exactly as she understood it would, while behind her, Dr. Hale's posture straightened, his arms uncrossing without him realizing it, his attention now fully locked onto the board, because something had changed, and for the first time since the moment began, he was no longer completely certain of how it would end. By the time Clara reached the middle of the equation, the room no longer sounded the same, because the laughter that once filled the air had thinned into scattered silence, and even the smallest movements now felt louder than before, the scratch of chalk against the board echoing with an unexpected weight, as if each line she wrote carried something more than just logic, something undeniable. And students who had leaned back in casual amusement were now sitting upright, their eyes fixed on the board, trying to follow steps that no longer fit the methods they had been taught, because Clara was not just solving the equation, she was reshaping it, approaching it from an angle that made the original structure look almost inefficient, and that realization settled slowly, like a quiet shift in gravity that no one could ignore once they felt it. And near the front, one student's pen hovered above his notebook, forgotten, while another stopped typing entirely, their screen dimming as their attention locked fully onto the unfolding solution, and Dr. Hale moved closer without announcing it, his shoes making a soft sound against the floor that seemed amplified in the stillness, his eyes narrowing as he tracked her work line by line, searching more carefully now, no longer expecting an obvious mistake, but hoping for a subtle one, something hidden in the transitions, something he could point to, correct, reclaim, but the transitions were clean, deliberate, precise in a way that did not leave room for easy critique, and Clara continued without pause, her movements now carrying a quiet confidence that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway, because it was consistent, unbroken, and real, and as she reached a particularly complex portion of the equation, the kind that usually required multiple steps and careful justification, she did not slow down, she simplified it in a way that made several students blink in disbelief, because what she had just written collapsed an entire section into something more elegant, more efficient, and unmistakably correct, and a soft exhale passed through the room, not quite a gasp, not quite a reaction, but something in between, the sound of expectation shifting again, this time more sharply, and Dr. Hale stopped moving altogether, his attention now fully fixed, his earlier composure replaced by a growing intensity that he did not attempt to hide, because this was no longer about proving a point. This was about understanding what he was seeing, and whether it was real, and Clara did not look back, did not seek acknowledgement. She simply continued, her chalk moving steadily as the final structure of the solution began to take shape, and with each new line, the space for doubt shrank further, replaced by something heavier, something that pressed against every assumption that had been made just minutes before, and the room felt different now, not just quieter but charged, as if everyone present understood, even if they had not yet said it out loud, that the moment had already gone too far to be undone, and whatever came next would not just finish the equation, it would redefine everything they thought they knew about the woman standing at the board. Clara's chalk slowed as she approached the final lines, not because she was unsure, but because every step now carried weight, and the room could feel it, that unmistakable sense that something decisive was about to happen, and no one moved, no one spoke. Not even the faint whispers that had once filled the space returned, because there was no room left for them. Only focus, only anticipation, and Dr. Hale stood just a few feet away now, close enough to see every detail of her work, his gaze locked onto the board with an intensity that betrayed everything he had assumed before, because what he was seeing was no longer just correct, it was deliberate, structured in a way that revealed not only understanding but mastery. And that realization settled heavily, pressing against the certainty he had carried into the room, and Clara continued, her movements steady, her posture unchanged, as if the pressure that filled the lecture hall did not reach her at all, as if she existed in a different space entirely, one defined not by expectation but by clarity. And then, with one final sequence, she completed the solution, the last line drawn cleanly beneath the others, connecting every step into a conclusion that left no gaps, no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, and for a moment, nothing happened, because the room did not know how to respond. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with realization, with the slow understanding that what they had just witnessed did not fit the narrative they had created, and a student near the front blinked, his mouth parting slightly as he looked from the board to Dr. Hale and back again, as if waiting for correction, for dismissal, for something to restore balance. But it did not come, and Dr. Hale did not speak, not immediately, his eyes scanning the solution again, tracing each step with increasing precision, searching not for confirmation now, but for error, for anything that could reduce what had just happened into something manageable. But there was nothing, and that absence of error was louder than any reaction could have been. And Clara placed the chalk down gently, the small sound it made against the tray echoing far more than it should have in the stillness. And only then did she step back, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her expression unchanged, not triumphant, not defiant, simply steady, as if she had done exactly what she intended to do and nothing more. And across the room, the shift became undeniable, the confidence that once filled the space replaced by something quieter, something heavier, as students looked at one another not with amusement, but with uncertainty, because the hierarchy they had relied on had just fractured in front of them. And at the center of it, Dr. Hale remained still, his voice absent, his authority suspended in a silence he had not anticipated, because for the first time in that room, the answer was not his to give. For several long seconds, Dr. Hale did not say a word, and that silence carried more weight than anything he could have spoken, because everyone in the room was waiting for him to take control again, to correct, to explain, to restore the order they understood. But he remained still, his eyes fixed on the board, as if the answer might change if he looked at it long enough, as if somewhere between the lines there would be a flaw he could seize, something to anchor himself back into authority. But the longer he looked, the clearer it became that there was nothing to challenge, nothing to dismiss, and that realization settled slowly across his face, subtle but unmistakable, a tightening of the jaw, a slight shift in posture, the kind of controlled reaction that tries to conceal more than it reveals. And across the room, students began to notice, because the absence of his voice was no longer just silence, it was confirmation. And one by one, their attention shifted away from the board and toward him, searching his expression for guidance, for interpretation, for any signal of how they were supposed to understand what had just happened. But he gave them none, and that absence left a vacuum that no one was prepared to fill, until finally, a single voice broke through, hesitant, uncertain, from somewhere near the front row. "Is that correct?" The question hanging in the air not as a challenge, but as a quiet admission that the answer was no longer obvious. And Dr. Hale inhaled, slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, before stepping closer to the board, his gaze tracing the final line once more. And when he spoke, his voice was measured, controlled, but stripped of the certainty it had carried before. "Yes," he said, the words simple, direct, undeniable, and the effect was immediate. A ripple moving through the room as students exchanged looks that no longer held amusement, but something else entirely, something closer to realization. Because in that single word, the entire narrative had shifted, and Clara remained where she stood, not reacting to the acknowledgement, not seeking validation, her expression unchanged, as if the outcome had never been in question for her. And that quiet confidence now stood in sharp contrast to the uncertainty surrounding everyone else. And Dr. Hale stepped back slightly, his eyes moving from the board to Clara, studying her now not as an interruption, but as something he had not accounted for, something that did not fit into the structure he relied on. And for a brief moment, the room felt suspended, caught between what had been assumed and what had been proven, and no one spoke, not because they were told to be silent, but because there was nothing left to say that would not sound smaller than what they had just witnessed. And in that silence, something fundamental shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, as the balance of certainty moved away from where it had always been and settled somewhere entirely unexpected, leaving behind a room that was no longer sure of what it thought it understood. No one returned to their notes. No one checked their phones, because whatever had just happened refused to let the room move forward as if nothing had changed. and the weight of that realization lingered in the air, pressing down in a way that made even the smallest sound feel out of place. And Clara stood quietly at the front, not claiming the moment, not acknowledging the attention that had shifted entirely toward her, as if she had already detached from the outcome the second she finished writing, and that restraint only made the contrast sharper, because across from her, Dr. Hale was still processing, his usual composure intact on the surface but subtly fractured underneath, his gaze returning to the board again, then back to Clara, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was steady, but there was a pause before the words came, a hesitation that had never existed in his lectures before. "Where did you learn that approach?" he asked, the question direct but carrying something beneath it, not curiosity alone but a need to understand, to place her within a framework that made sense. And for the first time since she stepped forward, Clara looked at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady in a way that did not challenge him but did not defer either, and she answered simply, "I studied it," her voice even, unembellished, offering no explanation beyond what was necessary, and a faint ripple moved through the room again, not laughter this time but something quieter, more uncertain, because the answer did not satisfy the expectation behind the question. It did not explain how someone they had dismissed so easily could stand where she was now. And Dr. Hale held her gaze for a moment longer, as if expecting more, but when none came, he shifted slightly, his attention returning once more to the board, and then, almost reluctantly, he gestured toward a section of her solution. "This step," he said, his tone measured. "You simplified it differently than standard method." And there was a subtle emphasis in his words, not accusation but examination, as if he needed to confirm that what he had seen was not only correct but intentional. And Clara glanced at the board briefly, then back at him. "The standard method assumes a constraint that is not necessary here," she said, her explanation concise, precise, and delivered without hesitation. And that was the moment something deeper shifted, because it was no longer just about the correct answer. It was about understanding beyond what had been taught, beyond what had been expected, and several students exchanged looks that now carried something closer to respect than doubt, because they could follow enough to realize that she was not just solving the problem, she was seeing it differently. And Dr. Hale's expression tightened slightly, not in rejection but in recognition, because he understood exactly what she meant, and more importantly, he understood the implication of it. And for a brief moment, he said nothing, and in that silence, the hierarchy that had once defined the room no longer held the same shape, not broken entirely but undeniably altered, as the presence of one quiet, overlooked woman had introduced something the room could not ignore, something that did not fit neatly into the roles they had assigned. And as Clara stepped back fully from the board, her hands relaxed at her sides, it was clear to everyone watching that the moment had moved beyond a simple demonstration. It had become something else entirely, something that could not be undone by explanation or dismissed by authority, leaving behind a silence that no one was willing to break first. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the room with a weight that made even breathing feel deliberate. And for the first time since the lecture began, no one was looking at Dr. Hale for direction, because their attention had shifted entirely, anchored now to Clara, not as an interruption, but as the center of something they did not fully understand yet could not ignore. And that shift was quiet but absolute, reflected in the way students leaned forward without realizing it, in the way notebooks remained untouched, in the way no one dared to speak first, as if any word might diminish what had just unfolded. And Dr. Hale stood still, his usual authority no longer filling the space the way it once had, not gone, but no longer unquestioned. And that difference was enough to change everything, because authority, once examined, never returns exactly as it was, and he knew it, even if he did not say it. His gaze resting on Clara not with dismissal, but with a measured recognition that carried both understanding and something quieter, something more reluctant, because he could not deny what had happened, and more importantly, he could not redefine it on his terms, and that realization lingered between them, unspoken but clear, and Clara did not step forward into it, did not claim it. She simply stood as she had from the beginning, composed, steady, her presence unchanged despite the shift around her, and that restraint made the moment even sharper, because it revealed something the room had not expected, that her purpose had never been to prove anything to them, only to respond when called. And that difference carried its own quiet power, and near the back, a student who had laughed earlier now sat completely still, his expression unreadable but his posture different, less certain, while another slowly closed her laptop, as if acknowledging that whatever this was could not be reduced to notes or summaries. And the room held that awareness together, a shared understanding forming without words, until finally, Dr. Hale moved, not with the sharp precision he had entered with, but more deliberately, stepping slightly aside from the board as if giving space not just physically but symbolically. And he glanced once more at the solution, then back at Clara, and for a brief moment, something close to humility passed through his expression, subtle enough that only those watching closely might notice. And then it was gone, replaced by a controlled neutrality, but the trace of it remained in the silence that followed, and Clara, without waiting for instruction, without seeking acknowledgement, simply nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and turned away from the board, her steps as measured as they had been when she walked forward, her presence leaving the front of the room without ceremony, without pause. And as she returned to her seat, no one spoke, not because they were unsure of what to say, but because they understood that nothing they could say would match the clarity of what they had just witnessed. And in that quiet, something settled into place. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that did not need to be announced, as the room, once filled with easy judgment, now held something far more difficult to ignore, the unmistakable weight of being proven wrong. The lecture did not resume the way it was supposed to, because something in the room had already moved beyond routine, beyond structure, beyond the predictable rhythm that Dr. Hale had always controlled, and for a moment that stretched longer than anyone expected, he simply stood there, the equation still visible behind him, unchanged yet no longer belonging to him in the same way. And when he finally turned back toward the class, his posture was composed but quieter, as if the certainty that once filled his presence had been adjusted, not removed, but tempered. And he glanced briefly toward Clara, now seated again in the back row, her notebook reopened, her pen resting lightly in her hand, as if she had already returned to something ordinary, as if the moment that had just reshaped the room had not altered her at all. And that contrast lingered, because everyone else felt it, the shift, the awareness, the subtle discomfort of realizing how quickly judgment had formed and how completely it had been overturned. And Dr. Hale cleared his throat softly, the sound breaking the silence in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. And when he spoke, his tone was measured, deliberate. "There are alternative approaches," he said, choosing his words carefully, not as a correction but as an acknowledgement, and no one missed the difference, because this was not how he usually spoke, not how he framed his authority. And a few students nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition of what he was doing, adjusting, recalibrating, and then, without drawing further attention to it, he turned back to the board and began outlining the standard method again. But the room did not follow in the same way, because now there was something else present, something unspoken that lingered between every line he wrote, a comparison that no one voiced but everyone felt. And Clara remained still, her focus on her notebook, her expression unchanged, not seeking attention, not responding to the subtle glances that still drifted in her direction, as if the validation that others might have needed had never been her purpose. And that quiet independence settled deeply into the atmosphere, reshaping not just how she was seen, but how the room understood itself. And near the front, a student who had laughed earlier now took notes more carefully, his movements slower, more deliberate, while another glanced back briefly toward Clara before returning to the board, her expression thoughtful, as if reconsidering something beyond the equation itself. And Dr. Hale continued speaking, his voice steady, but the space between his words carried a new weight, a recognition that knowledge alone did not define authority the way he once believed. And when the lecture finally ended, no one rushed to leave, no chairs scraped loudly against the floor, no conversations immediately filled the space. Instead, students gathered their things more quietly, more thoughtfully, and as Clara stood, placing her notebook into her bag with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning. She did not look toward the front, did not wait. She simply moved toward the exit, her steps steady, unhurried, and as she reached the door, a few eyes followed her, not with curiosity anymore, but with something quieter, something closer to respect. And when the door closed softly behind her, the room remained still for a moment longer, as if holding on to what had just happened. Because some lessons do not need to be explained, they settle in silence. And that day, the room did not remember the equation nearly as much as it remembered the moment it stopped underestimating the person who solved it.